Everybody in Washington seems to have an opinion on tariffs, whether they're too high, too low, whether workers are suffering or not. But very few people ever explain what the hell a tariff is. Our next guest, Katherine Tai, was United States Trade Ambassador under President Biden. She oversaw our tariff and trade policy. She talks to us about tariffs, the current administration's trade policy, and whether she was left off any signal chats when she was representative. Let's swear into the People's Cabinet, Katherine Tai. Trade Ambassador, Katherine Tai. Welcome to the People's Cabinet.
Thank you, Dan.
Okay, we have a lot to get to, but let me get to the news of the day. Signalgate is the talk of the town. 18 of the most senior Trump officials were on a signal chain Mike Waltz started. JG is the initials of Jameson Greer, the current trade ambassador. Your initials are KT. And Jake Sullivan was the Michael Waltz equivalent under President Biden. So I just want to know if you've ever been confused on a signal chain, the following people. Katie Tur, MSNBC.
Not to my awareness.
What about KT McFarland?
Oh, no.
Did you ever get any messages about golfing because people thought you were a Kirk triplet?
I think people know. Also, I think people know that I don't golf.
Okay, well, Steph Curry. You ever get any messages from Steph Curry thinking you were Klay Thompson?
Wow. No. I mean, I don't think Steph Curry knows who I am.
Well, maybe not the last time you'll get compared to Klay Thompson. Let's take a step back. Take me through a little bit of your career, and I will say a couple things, and I hope it doesn't hurt your feelings.
Okay.
I'm not sure anyone outside of the people who know it well know what a trade representative is, or that it's a member of the cabinet. And then there's a lot of talk about tariffs. I don't think anyone knows what the hell a tariff is. So take me through your career very briefly. Say what trade is, and then let's get into what the hell a tariff is.
Okay, great. So I'll try to give you the in a nutshell version. I was trained as a lawyer, went to law school. I did work as a lawyer when I was first out of law school for about 7 years. Then
And let me interrupt you. Did you know you wanted to go into government? Like, what was the moment in which you said, this is not for me and I want to eventually be a member of the cabinet?
Okay. I actually never said that.
Okay.
I never actually thought that I would be a member of anybody's cabinet. So after law school, I did two types of things. One is I worked for a couple law firms as a junior associate doing the things, the grunty kind of work. I also got a chance to clerk for 2 district court judges. And those experiences, I think, really transformed my life. They were small chambers. You got to work directly for a judge. Both the judges that I worked for have so much integrity. One was a Clinton appointee. One was a George W. Bush appointee. And I learned so much from them about the impact of law on people's lives. And frankly, working in a courthouse is really interesting. It's where the rule of law and our system of rights comes in contact with democracy and America. And at the time, I had friends who had decided to go to medical school instead of law school. And they were just getting out of their medical training and going into their residencies. And a lot of them worked in hospitals. And I realized, the courthouse is a little bit like the legal profession's hospital. It's a place where you come and you can file papers and or you have to defend yourself. It's where you interact with our system of laws. So that was very inspiring, that the work you were doing as a lawyer could impact people's lives, and then you could be a part of the solution to make sure that people who had been wronged could get paid back. People who had been hurt could have recourse. So I also worked for law firms, and there were some firms I worked for that were, I met a lot of great people, and the people who work in law firms, they're really good at their jobs. But one of the things I discovered was that sense of purpose and direct impact on the lives of people just like me in America. I didn't really have that in a law firm whose clients were big businesses. And the amount of work that I could do to contribute was also just one small part of a much larger whole. So I think about 6 years out of law school, I had an opportunity because one of my law school classmates had just been hired at this government agency called the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And actually, I had heard of USTR because of a class I had taken in law school about trade law. And people who know USTR have great things to say about it. People who go there are really smart. They're good at their jobs. They're really committed. They're kind of workaholics, but they're doing something that matters for Americans and the American economy.
And what is that?
Great question. So I've been asked this question a lot, and I did a lot of domestic travel when I was U.S. trade representative. And part of the thing is most Americans don't know about USTR and they don't know what it is, just like you said. So the most basic answer is the title is self-explanatory. The United States Trade Representative, that person's job is to represent the interests of the United States, the country, and all of its people and its businesses and its farmers in international trade.
And when you say trade, what does that mean?
That means all of the economic activity that has to cross borders.
And what's a hypothetical of that?
So, for example, when you go to the grocery store and you can get blueberries in the winter, well, some of those blueberries may be grown in greenhouses in, the southern states. But a lot of them are coming from the southern hemisphere, from countries where when it's winter for us, it's summer for them. And those blueberries are packed into crates and they're put onto ships, and those ships come to the U.S. and they're imported at a port. The containers are unloaded, they're distributed, and they end up on grocery store shelves. So that's all a part of trade. It's the movement of goods across borders. And it's not just goods. In the modern economy, it's also services. So if, for example, you have a small business, and let's say you're a graphic designer, right? So your business is on the web, and people can write you and say, I'm going to start a business myself, and I need a logo. This is what I'd like it to be. I'd like it to be red and blue, and I'd like it to be flowers. Could you design a logo for me? And you say, sure, I can do that, and it will cost $100. If your client lives outside of the United States, then that is a services exchange. That is a services export on your part, and it is a services import for them. So all of this interconnectivity between the U.S. economy and the rest of the world is based on the activity of trade. And trade policy is policy that tries to shape how that activity happens. And that's a lot of what USTR does. The USTR under statute is the principal spokesperson, negotiator, advisor on trade policy, sits in the president's cabinet. But the entire agency should be doing work internationally with other countries to represent the interests of America, to make sure that the American economy can grow and to be vibrant and will have good jobs as a result of our trade activities.
And so we'll get to tariffs, which is obviously a big part of the work that you do. But if you could just give a brief overview of the main branches of USTR and just some hypotheticals or illustrative examples of what they do.
Sure. Something that USTR is well known for is negotiating trade agreements. So I'm just going to put this out there because there are some big trade agreements that have really shaped the contours of our economy. And we thought, America, I'm not going to get into the partisan roles here because it turns out that for many, many decades, whether they were Democratic administrations or Republican administrations, we were largely pursuing the same types of trade policies. And they involved negotiating these really big, aggressive, free trade agreements. And those will be USTR negotiators on the front lines, in the rooms, with the negotiators from the other countries to create these trade agreements that were supposed to grow the pie for everybody, right? I started with a little bit of a caveat because today in 2025, and maybe for the last 10, 15 years, we have collectively started to really become aware of the fact that while our trade agreement agenda, led by the negotiators at USTR, who were following the policy instructions of leadership from both parties, that the pie has grown for the United States economy. Our GDP is much bigger today than it was in the 1990s, right? The pie may have grown for the entire world. World GDP has grown by a lot. But what we're seeing is that fewer and fewer people have access to that prosperity pie.
Yep.
That the levels of inequality today are as gross as they were at the time of the, quote, Gilded Age, which, by the way, is a really nice way of describing a really terrible time. The Gilded Age was a time when there were industries like steel and the railroads, where the people who controlled those industries were so rich, they built mansions for themselves, right? Yeah. In New York City. Then they had enough money to build themselves these amazing summer palaces in Rhode Island. But the majority of Americans really, really struggled to get by. And whether you were a factory worker or a farm worker, you had very little rights, and you were under just incredibly dire circumstances, and your opportunity to make a better life for yourself or to offer a better life for your kids was completely limited. So, I think part of the challenge for us today is, with the levels of inequality that we have, with the challenges that we're facing, the headwinds from increasingly wild climate events, wildfires, floods, that, by the way, impact you whether you're rich or poor, right? The wild ride we're on around technology and this digital transformation, is it going to be good for us or bad for us? And we really don't know. And also the sense that, the economic opportunity is slipping away from too many Americans. I think it's less about looking back to the past. I think that there's a role for looking back to the past for lessons about what contributed to good times, what was a problem, what caused the bad times. But our focus should really be on the future, because this world is different from the past.
I want to talk a little bit about the future, because the president and trade is central to his agenda, and anything that will become of the future when it comes to trade will involve tariffs. There's a lot to get to here, but first and foremost, I want to ask you, what the hell is a tariff? And if you could give examples that are simple and easy for our listeners to understand, and then I want to talk a little bit about how you view the president's posture here.
Great. Okay. So this is the most uninteresting part, but you really kind of need it, and you asked me to provide it. What is a tariff, right? A tariff is a charge that you make at the border as a good is coming across the border, and you're receiving it from the rest of the world into your economy.
So I am a car manufacturer in South Korea.
Okay.
And I'm looking to bring my car to the U.S.
Yes.
Take me through that as if I were that South Korean car maker.
Okay. So you make cars. Let's say you make sedans, and you want to sell them in the United States. And you have to put them on a ship, and they're going to land at a port, they're going to come across the border. There's a lot of paperwork there, right? Because there needs to be integrity that, what's in the box or what's on the ship is what you say it is. Great. At the border, we would charge a 2.5% tariff. That's the tariff that we applied to cars coming from all over the world. You pick South Korea, though. And this is a bad example because we have a free trade agreement with South Korea. Yeah. Okay, but let's say you're producing cars,
and that means no percentage, or that means a low percentage, or what does that mean?
So this is part of the legacy of our free trade agreement practice, which is, as a result of our free trade agreement with South Korea, we have said we will no longer charge you 2.5% at the border. Your cars can come in tariff free.
Okay. But an example that's not South Korea.
Okay.
I apologize.
All right. So you are a car maker, and you are making your cars in Japan. And you want to ship that car to the U.S. to sell it in the U.S. We're going to charge you 2.5% on the value of that car as it's coming across the border.
And is that, let's say a car from Japan, a Toyota, is $20,000 to an American here. And where does that 2.5% get levied? Is it on the 20,000? Is it on something else? How does that work?
It's a great question, and this is a little embarrassing for trade policy person who is trade representative. But I will say this: all respect to the people who are specialists in customs law, customs brokers. There are a lot of rules that you have to apply. So I'll just say, overall in concept, right? You're going to have to declare a value for how much your car is worth. And then the tariff attaches to your declared value at the border.
Okay.
I think that it's important to understand, this is part of the conversation right now, that tariff is paid at the border by the person who is the importer of record, which is probably a business, right? Cars are really expensive things.
And so I just want to it's important to emphasize this point because I think President Trump especially is trying to make it seem like the governments are getting the brunt of this, right? That he will say Canada has been, we have an unfair agreement with Canada, we have an unfair agreement with XYZ, but it's the companies, right, is what you're saying, that actually pay the duty.
That's right. But Dan, I'm going to disappoint you here because I know there's a lot of tariff learning that's going on, and maybe I'm the wrong person to answer because I've got too much inside my head. But that's right. They are businesses that are interacting and paying those tariffs at the border. Here's the issue, though. The governments are going to be really concerned if you start jacking up those tariffs because, relatively speaking, 2.5% is really not that much.
Yep.
Right? But if you say, I'm going to put a 25% tariff at the border, the governments are going to get upset because that is going to impact the ability of all the car producers in that country and their economics for selling in the United States. And so there is a cost to that country and its economy. And so, I think that this allows me to address a particular issue, which is currently the public discourse around tariffs is super, super limited, right? You have one side saying the tariffs are amazing, tariffs are beautiful, tariffs are powerful, right? And you have the other side saying, no, you don't understand how tariffs work. Tariffs are just going to increase costs. They're going to drive inflation. They're gonna make consumers unhappy. Well, it turns out there's a little bit of truth in both, right? And as long as we have staked out these positions that are in opposition to each other, we miss the entire point. And I'm going to give you this analogy, which I think is relatable because I'm not a specialist in this field, and I feel like I'm able to articulate this analogy. A tariff on its own is just a tool. It all depends on how you use it. So my analogy is think of tariffs as 2x4s. If you had a bunch of tariffs, like a bunch of 2x4s, you could use them strategically to build something. If you had a blueprint and you knew what you were trying to build. So you got a bunch of 2x4s, you could build a house, you could build a school, you could build a factory. Right? You would need a blueprint and you would need more than just the 2x4s. You'd need drywall, you'd need bricks, you'd need plaster, all of those things. All right. But a 2x4 you could also pick up and you could break a window with it. You could threaten to beat someone up with it. You could actually use a 2x4 to seriously hurt someone and beat them up with it, right? So that's what I want to bring to the tariff conversation, which is let's all understand, it is really useful to understand what a tariff is, how it's applied. It's important to understand that tariffs can be used and have generally been used under our laws to level the playing field with imports that are coming in that are unfairly traded and too cheap and threaten to wipe out an American industry and jobs. And that's part of the reason why there are people in America who actually have really positive associations with tariffs. Tariffs as a way to even the playing field with unfair trading practices, tariffs that have been used to save industries and jobs.
Can you give an example of those?
Yeah, so if you go to the industrial Midwest, that has gone through a lot in the last many decades, right? This was a part of America that was booming after that industrial growth post World War II. Steel mills, car factories, and then all of the parts and components that go into cars, right? And all of the manufacturing that can come from having steel close by. Over time, as other parts of the world have developed and industrialized, over time, as we've entered into more of these types of trade agreements to make it easier for us to trade and make it easier for us to move our production to cheaper jurisdictions, those industries have struggled to stay alive. And under our laws, we have duties, tariffs, that those industries and their workers can petition for to say there is some serious unfair trade going on. We are competing with products that have been created using subsidies from the government that are being actually sold into the U.S. at a loss as part of a predatory scheme to drive our production out so that another country's industry can take over our market and the world market. Please, please, please put tariffs on at the border so that we can survive, so that the United States can continue to have some of these production industries and we can continue to have our jobs.
And then how does that work in practice? There is a certain amount of tariff you put on something coming in that would make it more expensive or just as expensive as a domestically produced thing. Is there an example you have in mind?
Yeah, so let's take the example of you make staples.
Great, I know what those are.
Okay, all right. And you're selling staples in a box for, let's say, $1 a box. Okay, and you know that, in order to make a profit, and you're charging $1, right? Maybe it's costing you 50 cents to make that box, and you're going to have 50 cents of profit, and you use that 50 cents to grow. Now all of a sudden, you see staples being sold at the office supply store, and they're being sold for 10 cents a box. And you're looking at that and you're thinking, wait a minute, it cost me 50 cents to make a box of staples. How are these staples being sold for 10 cents a box? And you say, oh, you look at the box and you realize that it's made in another country. It's an import. Well, maybe they're cheaper because of cost savings, because of lower labor costs, lower regulatory costs. Maybe there's some kind of advantage in terms of really efficient staple making in that country. But you think that something funky is going on because there's really, you can't imagine how a box of staples could be made for less than 10 cents. So you would go to the Commerce Department and you would say, hey, I think there's something seriously wrong going on here, and I am going to go out of business. Can you look into this? What the Commerce Department would do is they would run an investigation. They would look at where these staples are coming from, who's producing them. The Commerce Department actually would send lawyers and economists to that country, to those producers, and they would ask them to open up their books, their accounting. And they would try to determine whether or not they are being fairly produced and sold into the U.S. Right? And if they find that they are not being fairly produced and sold, that there is something predatory going on.
What does that mean? How do they define fairly produced?
So what if they go in and they find, oh, wait, no, it also costs 50 cents to produce these staples here, but you're selling them at 10 cents. That's dumping.
Right.
You're selling them at a loss. You're not allowed to do that, right, under international trade rules.
But what if they just have cheaper labor costs in the country?
Okay, so before I get there, let's look at, it's cost. They're able to sell at that low a price because the government is giving them subsidies. Maybe there are tax incentives. They're altering their cost structure, right? I'll follow this to the conclusion of the story and come back on the lower labor costs. If the Commerce Department finds that, then they've got to do the calculations. So what kind of a tariff do we need to put at the border to even out the competition for those staples to be sold in the U.S. market and for our producers to be able to compete fairly, right? But that margin that's calculated for the tariff is based on a lot of data and economic analysis. So sometimes the Commerce Department comes out and says, yeah, you're right. And, the margin of the tariff that needs to be applied to even things out is, let's say, I'm just pulling these numbers out of the air, but for the Commerce Department be based on calculations, 17%. Sometimes they do the calculations, and depending on the facts and the economics, sometimes it's as high as 700%. The point is that if you have an objective, which is to even the playing field, and you will need to know specifically what you're looking at, you would need to know the data, and then you would come out with a particular number to even the playing field. I wanted to point that out because part of what we're seeing in the current administration is a lot of blanket tariff actions that are being announced, right? So they're not scoped to address a particular industry. It's just across the board. And then the numbers are like weirdly round numbers. It's 10%, it's 25%, right? And like those could make sense. But is there analysis to back that up? Or are those just numbers that are making us feel good? Okay, I'm going to come back to your question about what if it's just that they have lower labor costs? What if this is a much less developed country with a lower cost of living, with frankly lower economic development at a lower level of economic development? You would want to see if the lower labor costs are just a natural part of their economic development, because it just doesn't cost as much for a worker to be able to provide for their family and to get food on the table, right? Or if there's some kind of distortive suppression that's happening in that economy. Is there a system in that economy and in that country that is preventing those workers from being able to exercise any rights? For being able to advocate for health and safety standards inside of their workplace, for being able to organize or to form a union, for being able to have recourse if they are being badly treated. The worst kind of example is, what if in that economy they are kids or other people that are being forced to work and under modern slavery conditions, right? That is also a kind of unfair trade that, frankly, even our traditional tools don't really reach. But there's an active debate about whether or not, when we're looking at fairness of trading and leveling the playing field, we should also be looking at those factors.
Got it. And just technically speaking, when there's a decision to put a 2.5% tariff on a vehicle, or in the case of President Trump, 25%, what is the technical steps that it takes to actually have that hit people's bank account? Or is it completely, or hit to a company's bank account? Is that totally subject to the president's whim? Is there any kind of oversight on that? Or could he, in theory, put 1,000% tariff on everything tomorrow?
Okay. So what's the legal authority for the president and the executive branch to be imposing these tariffs? Well, it turns out that tariff authority actually is given in the Constitution to the Congress. And the ability of the executive branch to impose tariffs comes from authority that has been delegated by Congress to the executive branch. And, it makes sense if you look historically, right? Congress isn't going to be running these dumping investigations, these unfair trade investigations. That's been delegated to the executive branch and the Commerce Department. And if they find that there's something that needs to be done, you shouldn't have to go back to Congress for the right to apply those tariffs, right? So there's a reason why Congress has delegated all this authority. And what I think the main point is that they are through laws and statutes that authority has been applied. there are very specific circumstances. Leveling the playing field to address trade cheating and unfair trade is one of the most classic areas of delegation where the executive branch has a lot of authority. What is interesting is in these first 2 months of the Trump administration, we do see in the more formal documents that are coming out of the White House, whether they are memos or proclamations, that there is a legal authority that is being cited and that is being used. What that means is that the administration is still consulting and being guided by its lawyers. It still cares about the legality of some of these actions. Because we are seeing in other areas in the administration an increasing willingness to test the laws, to push beyond the rule of law, an increasing embrace of lawlessness, I think it is an important area for us to keep our eye on, whether or not these trade and tariff actions continue to be tied to legal authorities.
If Democrats had control of the House or the Senate, would they have a case, in your opinion, to challenge, like when Trump says, I'm going to put 25% on all cars, to challenge that? Or do you think that the authority's been delegated in the sense that the president has a right to do that?
So in terms of the right to challenge, because it's all written out in statute, anybody could sue the administration if they think that they have taken an action illegally, either because they didn't cite any authority or because the authority that they cite just doesn't really seem to be legitimate. Right? And I think that I've heard, I haven't seen, but I've heard that there are some litigation actions that have been started up. The role for Congress is to figure out whether or not they're still comfortable with the current delegations of authority. And if they feel like there are abuses of that authority, it's less about challenge here, right? Or legal challenge. I think it's about institutional challenge. Congress, under the Constitution, is a co-equal branch of government. Congress has the power to change the balance of authorities between itself and the executive. And the question is whether or not Congress can organize itself to assert its own institutional prerogative. And I think that's an open question even today. We're not seeing a lot of it. But the question is, if you've been elected to Congress, your mandate is to represent the people of your district, of your state. It's not to do whatever the executive wants. Your interests are separate, and it's been designed to be that way under the Constitution.
So you talked a little bit about the lack of precision in the Trump tariff strategy. I want to first have you explain what a reciprocal tariff is, your view of what the Trump tariff agenda is, the way you see it. And then I also want to just talk briefly, too, about what you think like the kind of mentality there is, because there seems to be, to your point, a kind of shift in the Republican Party where it used to be free trade and business, global business without a lot of regulation was the popular thing. Now, and Steve Bannon has espoused this, others have, they point to trade agreements that have hollowed out manufacturing. Mm-hmm. And there's almost like a unanimity, that's maybe a too strong a word, between Democrats and Republicans about how trade agreements in the past have hurt American workers. So I'd love your thoughts on that.
Okay. When I hear the word reciprocity in the context of trade, it reinforces something that we know, which is, by the way, 2.5% tariff on, passenger vehicles is really, really low. And it's really low relative to a lot of other countries. Most other countries have much, much higher tariffs for most things, including for cars, right? So our economy is pretty darn open as it is. We have a pretty low, what we call tariff rate, just on an everyday basis.
To other countries.
Okay. And for goods coming in. When you look at where the tariffs are for other countries, and you look at that average applied tariff rate, it's higher in most other countries. Then that makes you feel like, wait, that seems like it might be a disadvantage to us sometimes if we have a lower tariff rate and it's easier for their producers to send their goods here. But our producers have to pay higher tariffs to access their markets. It feels like something's not quite right there, right? I think that the crux of that idea of reciprocity in trade and fairness, there's something there. There's another argument, which is part of what's allowed the American economy to grow, is the fact that we have relatively low tariff barriers into our economy. I think that there is a case to be made for that, and that was certainly the premise for the era of free trade. But the era of free trade is coming to an end in both parties, in large part because people aren't dumb. You've been told for a generation that lowering your tariffs, zeroing out your tariffs, doing more free trade agreements is going to lead us to the land of milk and honey where everything's going to be peaceful and we're all going to be prosperous. But look around the world today. Today, the world is not peaceful. There are active wars that are going on right now, active conflict, despite all of the globalization and the low tariffs. And that prosperity point, bring it back. Some people are really prosperous. Most people are not that prosperous. And a lot of those people are really struggling, right? So I think that this is affecting both sides of the aisle. And the question is the Trump administration actually using its trade policies to address that lack of opportunity, that lack of economic vitality that people are feeling? Because what I would say is trade has a role. Tariffs can have a role if you got a blueprint and you're clear about what you're trying to do, right? There's a lot of invocation of working class interests currently in the administration, by actually a lot of the big billionaires who are serving in that administration. The issue is that if tariffs have a role in revitalizing American manufacturing, in creating economic opportunity in areas that have been really hurt by imports and trade, tariffs alone are not going to do the job. If you just build a wall with tariffs, but you let whatever opportunity for creating new jobs or for shoring up industries flow away because your other policies are just leaching those types of gains out. If you say that you're going to raise tariffs so that the government can have revenue to justify cutting taxes on the biggest corporations and the richest Americans, you're kind of doing exactly the opposite. So, what is the Trump administration actually doing with its trade policy? The jury is really out. I am going to be making sure that we are all scrutinizing the Trump administration and taking it at its word. If they are going to use trade policy to create jobs, to reinvigorate American manufacturing, to give the American working class that fair shot at moving up in the world that they deserve, then I will want to make sure that we are calling them out if that's not what they're doing.
So you alluded to this, but I want to get to the alternate positive vision.
Okay.
And I think it's important to also maybe put this in the context of, inflation is still not where we need it to be. There are some arguments and concerns about tariffs and the prices that might come as a result of charging more for goods. Also, there's an argument that people talk a lot about small businesses that do import, that sell, that will be affected by it. So how do you see the positive alternative vision right now? If there were a President Harris, what would you see as the ideal policy given the realities of the market right now And how should the people listening think about this in terms of the context of their kitchen table and their communities?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a really important one. It's also a really hard one. I feel like you're setting me up. but but I really like you, Dan. So this is what I'm going to say. And again, I think this is the honest answer. Just remind yourself and everybody who's tuning in who you're asking this question, right? You're asking someone who knows a lot about trade policy, who was the trade representative in the last 4 years. The questions that you're asking would require more than just trade policy expertise to answer them. Yes, do tariffs play a role in all of this? Yes, probably not as big a role as people think. We could use a macroeconomist at the table. We could use someone who is really dialed into the financial markets. We could use someone who's a labor economy expert. We would need to, and someone who's expert on monetary policy. Maybe that's what the macroeconomist contributes. And we'd need to put all of those pieces together to really understand and to be able to map out what's happening right now and what the policies should have been. But I also want to just take the spirit of the question, which is, what's another way that we could be using trade policy? And I think that we could be using trade policy in a way where it's not premised on the unpredictability, right? I think that the chaos and the keeping people guessing, and which is frustrating for consumers, it's frustrating for workers, it's frustrating for farmers, it's frustrating for the businesses, small businesses, and the biggest businesses. Wall Street, I think, is kind of really at its wit's end. What is going on? I think that that's the feature. That's a feature rather than a bug for this administration. It's quite a lot of power to keep all of these people guessing, including some really powerful, really rich people, right? But if the ability to use the levers of government and to shape policy, if you think that there's a role for responsible, maybe less exciting architecture and design to play, and that it's not all just political drama, then I think that sending clear signals about what you want to happen, when it's going to happen, the tools that you're going to use to make it happen, would actually allow you to get people and businesses on board more effectively. And that's people and businesses, farmers, right? Like content creators here in the United States, but also your trading partners and your foreign partners. If you made it really clear what you were about, and it turns out that they agree with you, they're also about that. Teamwork makes the dream work is what I'm saying, right? If all of you are pulling in the same direction because you've been really clear about what you want to happen and how you're going to do it, I think ultimately you become much, much more effective. But, if you're really prizing the adrenaline rush of the 2x4 that's just whizzing around, it's much harder to accomplish the things that you might want to accomplish that go beyond that adrenaline rush or that sugar rush.
Do you have an example of a good or some aspect of trade policy that are kind of top of mind that's maybe in your craw right now that's not being addressed that should be if Democrats were the people still in the White House?
Sure. Let me take the example of the clean technology industrial revolution that our economy has every right to play in and to compete in, right? That's solar panels, that's wind turbines, renewable energy sources, that's electric vehicles, that's batteries in general. Everything requires energy. If you can create energy from renewable sources, right? We know the entire world industry is focused on this. And we are a contender. We are a contender, and we should continue to be a contender. We can be a really strong contender. That was something that we were on our way to doing in the last administration. And guess what? we used tariffs. The China-facing tariffs, we kept almost all of them. And in fact, we increased them significantly on solar panels, as an example, and electric vehicles. In fact, for EVs, we increased it by 100%. But we weren't just relying on those tariffs to transform the American economy and to give our industrial base that push. We paired it with all of the incentives that were bound up in the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act was an industrial turbocharge for incentivizing and attracting investment here in the United States to create good jobs for American workers in these new and emerging fields, right? If you put those two together and you compare them with stronger worker protections, real health and safety protections for workers, and you're also driving a strong competition policy where you say, these are all of the ingredients for strong industries, but we also want to make sure that no one company gets so big that it monopolizes all of the industry. If you can combine all of those things, which includes tariffs, by the way, right? Appropriately scoped tariffs that are part of a larger blueprint, then I think that you can build confidence. You can create those jobs. One of the challenges that I think that I really see right now that will affect confidence in the policies of this administration are less about the willingness to use tariffs and more about the willingness to step up in these other areas. Because at the same time that they're raising tariffs across the board, this administration is also making threats and taking steps to unwind the Inflation Reduction Act, to delete the National Labor Relations Board, to gut the Department of Labor, and to try to fire half the workforce, half the leadership of the trust-busting agency, the Federal Trade Commission.
Can you give, this is very challenging to do briefly, but can you just briefly talk a little bit more about the labor standards aspect of this that I know was so dear to you when you were trade representative, and aspects, hypothetical or concrete aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act that were incenting workers here that people may not know?
Sure. Okay. So really basic on why, as a trade representative, I cared so much about the labor standards. The types of free trade agreements we've entered into, the kind of globalization that our trade policy has really facilitated, has been one that's really created winners by incentivizing big companies to put their production in the cheapest places possible. And so what's happened is that countries are competing with each other for those types of investments and jobs by cutting their standards, including their labor standards. Right? If I don't have to make sure that workplaces are safe and that there are fire exits on every floor and that there are fire extinguishers on the workshop floor, that's a lot of cost that a company doesn't have to pay, right? And the more I can cut the costs by cutting those types of standards, the more I win in this system. So then you have what we call a race to the bottom, where everybody's just trying to have the fewest and lowest standards possible because that's what's getting rewarded in the system. And then you have a world, you have a globalized world where, guess what? The owners of the companies are making money hand over fist. And the people who are actually working to make the product or supply the services are so poor that they can barely get by, right? So that's why labor standards are so important, because guess what? It doesn't have to be this way. We chose the code that goes into this version of globalization that's led to this result.
And it gives you the right then to enforce that as anyone who wants to participate in the agreement or the ecosystem.
If you change the code and say that you can't trade and have these goodies unless you are raising your labor standards, unless you are giving your workers that fair shot to have a living wage, put food on the table, send their kids to school, then we're not going to make it easier for you. Then that's right. That's the reason why labor standards are so important in our trade agreements. And by the way, people might not know this, but in U.S. trade policy, it has been longstanding and bipartisan that there need to be high labor standards and high environmental standards for us to do trade in a really enhanced way. And the issue there is that for that to be meaningful, you've got to be able to enforce it. The Inflation Reduction Act is really confusing because it was very cleverly named, but it doesn't really describe what's in the actual legislation. Some of the most important parts in the legislation are things like tax incentives and other types of goodies that companies can get benefits if they invest in factories here, if they invest in the research and the technology here, if they will create the jobs here in these industries. So those are the types of incentives I'm talking about where, right, it's a carrot. It's a policy carrot. Hey, if you do these things that we want you to do, right, we'll make it easier for you and we'll give you a goodie, right? The tariff side is a little bit of a stick, right? Which is to say, oh, and by the way, right now we're competing with some major international players that probably aren't producing fairly and are threatening to wipe out these industries before we even get them started. We're going to also use the tariffs to put up a defense. And it's a game of offense and defense. You have the carrots, that's the offense, right? This is what you get. Is that something you want? And here's the defense. And you're going to have to wean yourself off of the cheap products and the cheap inputs that are coming in unfairly. That's the mix of policy tools. And, I appreciate the opportunity to break it down because I think it really is that basic, that you want to have a policy mix to maximize the likelihood you're going to accomplish the goal that you're trying to accomplish. And you have to have multiple policies in there, and they have to operate as incentives and as disincentives.
Is it a fair characterization that thoughtful trade policy is an art, not a science, of the combination of the carrot and the stick, and that what we're seeing from this administration is far more stick than carrot, and to be thoughtful about the outcomes that you want, which is a prosperous America where everyone has a shot to earn the wages to put food on the table, that art needs to be far more refined?
I think that's right, and I might just adapt that analogy a little bit because I think that trade policy isn't beautiful like art. It doesn't inspire your soul like art does, right? So that's giving us more credit than is due. And I was also thinking, well, what's another example? Going back to construction and carpentry. Would I say that, a thoughtful trade policy is like really skilled carpentry? You know what? I took a wood shop class when I was in middle school, and I think that that's probably giving trade policy more credit than it's due also. But I will say that thoughtful trade policy is really important, and it does require skill, and it does require coordination and teamwork.
This has been an incredible discussion. The one thing that I want to make sure that people who are listening take away is I think a lot of people in their communities know a lot of very disaffected people. They don't vote anymore, or they're feeling just dispirited by Republicans and Democrats. And they know a lot of people who are MAGA voters now who voted for Trump and maybe had voted for Biden. So what's your best advice for people who want to persuade either disaffected citizens or MAGA citizens to say, I should get back on board with the Democratic Party and the policies that you talked about?
Sure. I think this is the $1 million question, or the $1 billion question, if you will. We're still all Americans. In fact, I without even having had this conversation, Dan, I already know that you and I grew up with people either in our families or in our schools or communities who are exactly the disaffected voters, MAGA voters too. We know these people and we grew up with them, right? So I think first we have to remember that we're all Americans. And we have to really try to understand why we're looking at the world differently. And I would say it would be really great if those people would take the effort to understand why we see the world differently. By building that bridge towards each other, I think it's our only hope to figuring out how we can all be successful. Because our inability to communicate with each other, there's sort of at least two Americas right now that don't even talk to each other and that actually are rewarded by beating up on each other. I don't think this goes anywhere good for the entirety of America. We've got this really significant split in our identity and in our person. If you think of America as a person, we need to figure out how to heal that split. And I think that it's going to require us to adapt our rhetoric, to do a heck of a lot of work, and then to always, always be honest. I think honesty is maybe not its best policy, but it might not be the best political messaging. But holding ourselves and each other accountable, I think, is part of our pathway forward and our pathway out of this death spiral.
So you talked a little bit about the heal.
Yes.
I'm curious in your thoughts on the trade policy and how we're going to see tariffs on the news every single day, probably for the next 4 years.
Yeah.
And so when they're watching that and they're thinking, I'm not sure whether I like, the president is talking tough talk and I like that he's fighting for the United States. What would you say as they think about that? What the reality should be and how they should be thinking that through.
Sure. So we need to be asking the right questions. If you're part of America that feels good about tariffs, ask, what are the tariffs supposed to be doing? And who are they supposed to be helping? If you're part of the America that is really skeptical and anxious about the tariffs, ask the same question. What are these tariffs supposed to be doing? And who are they supposed to be helping? And I think that if we are together asking those questions, then that is going to give us a pathway to coming together, because it may be that we agree that these tariffs should be used to make the American manufacturing economy stronger, that these tariffs should be used to make sure that we keep the good jobs we have in certain sectors and create new good jobs in sectors that we don't even have yet. If we keep asking those questions, it increases the likelihood that we're actually going to get those goals achieved, because we deserve to have those things. But if we let ourselves get distracted by the drama, we let ourselves get distracted by the monologues and the speeches, right? If we're only looking at the wrestling ring and the costumes and the speeches, then we risk losing everything that matters to us.
Ambassador Tai, thanks for coming on the People's Cabinet.
Thank you so much, Dan.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the People's Cabinet. If you did, please like, subscribe, ring that bell, and put in the comments below who else you'd like to see sworn in. And stay tuned for new episodes every Tuesday. Let's go.